You're standing in your kitchen at 6:47 p.m., scraping dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets off a plastic plate into the trash. Your toddler ate 3 bites, maybe 4. There's smeared sweet potato on the high chair, a yogurt pouch squeezed onto the floor, and your kid is screaming for crackers. Just crackers. You sigh, open the cabinet, and hand over the crackers, because at least they're eating something. You grab your phone, maybe Google, "Is my child eating enough?" And somewhere between the parenting forums and the pediatrician's reassuring voicemail, you move on with your night. Now rewind that scene about 40,000 years. There is no cabinet. There are no crackers. There is no pediatrician and no voicemail. There is a cave mouth open to a frozen step, a fire that took an hour to build, and a piece of cooked animal meat that your child just turned away from. The only food your group has found today. So the question is brutally simple. For hundreds of thousands of years, with no backup snacks, no formula, no grocery store safety net, what did ancient humans actually do when a child refused to eat? The answer starts in your mouth, not your child's. Yours. Before blenders existed, before baby food came in jars, before anyone had even invented pottery, your ancestors solved the problem of feeding a small human whose teeth weren't ready and whose throat couldn't handle raw food the same way birds do. They chewed it first. This practice is called premastication, and if that word sounds clinical, the reality is anything but. A parent would take a piece of meat, a handful of cooked tubers, maybe some foraged berries, chew it into a soft paste, and transfer it directly into their baby's mouth, lip to lip, tongue to tongue. Researchers at Cornell University identified this behavior as one of the oldest continuous feeding practices in human history, documented in the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus around 1550 BC, but almost certainly stretching back hundreds of thousands of years before that. Chimpanzees do it, gorillas do it, and your ancestors, without question, did it too. Here's what nobody tells you about premastication, though. It wasn't just about softening food. When a parent chews food and passes it to a child, they're also passing along digestive enzymes that help an infant's immature gut break down nutrients it couldn't handle alone. They're transferring immune compounds from their own saliva, antibodies, beneficial bacteria, a kind of biological starter kit for the child's developing immune system. Researchers Gretel Pelto and Jean-Pierre Habicht at Cornell published a landmark paper in 2010 arguing that premastication was effectively the second arm of infant feeding alongside breastfeeding, essential not just for calories but for immunological priming. Your ancestors weren't just feeding their kids, they were vaccinating them with dinner. And that mouth-to-mouth transfer? Some evolutionary biologists, including Irenus Abel-Ibisfeld, have argued it's the origin of the human kiss. The most intimate gesture you know may have started as a parent desperately trying to keep a child alive, but premastication only solves half the problem. It gets food into a baby's mouth in a form they can swallow. It doesn't explain what happened when the child simply didn't want to eat, when they turned their head, clamped their lips shut, or spit the food back out. Because here's the part nobody talks about. Children refusing food isn't a modern invention. It's an ancient biological program, and it exists for a terrifying reason. Between roughly 18 months and 6 years of age, nearly every human child enters a phase scientists call food neophobia, a deep, instinctive suspicion of anything unfamiliar on their plate. Research published in the journal Nutrients in 2022 confirmed that this phase peaks between ages 2 and 6, and twin studies suggest it's roughly 78% heritable. That means it's not learned, it's wired in. Your toddler isn't being difficult. Their brain is running software written during the Pleistocene, when a curious 2-year-old wandering away from camp and shoving an unknown berry into their mouth could be dead within the hour. The children who hesitated, who refused the unfamiliar, who screamed and spit and demanded only what they'd eaten safely before, those were the children who survived long enough to become your ancestors. Picky eating is a survival adaptation. It kept children alive when the world was full of things that could poison them. Think about that for a second. The thing that drives you insane at the dinner table every night is the same instinct that kept your genetic line unbroken for 300,000 years. But the ancient world couldn't just wait for the phase to pass. A child refusing food in a hunter-gatherer band wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Calories were hard to come by, and a child who wouldn't eat was a child sliding toward malnutrition, weakened immunity, and death. Across 17 different hunter-gatherer societies, studied by researchers Anthony Volk and Jeremy Atkinson in 2013, nearly half of all children, 49%, died before reaching puberty. Almost half. And while disease and injury claimed many of those lives, malnutrition was the invisible thread running through nearly every one of those deaths, weakening small bodies until something else finished the job. So ancient humans couldn't just shrug, they adapted. And the way they adapted reveals something profound about what it actually means to be human. The first adaptation was communal. Your ancestors didn't raise children in isolated nuclear families. They raised them in dense cooperative networks that anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, in her 2009 book Mothers and Others, calls cooperative breeding. A mother wasn't the only one feeding a child. Grandmothers fed children. Aunts fed children. Older siblings fed children. Among the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies, studied extensively by anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, children begin foraging for their own food as early as 3 to 5 years old, and by age 5 they're collecting a significant percentage of their daily calories themselves. But before that age, a network of caregivers, what researchers call allomothers, surrounds every child like a safety net made of people. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. If your child refuses food from you, that doesn't mean they'll refuse food from everyone. A child who rejects a tuber from their mother might accept the same food, chewed and offered, from a grandmother whose mouth tastes different, whose approach is different, whose calm is different. The cooperative breeding model didn't just distribute labor, it distributed persuasion. It gave a reluctant child 5 or 6 different people with 5 or 6 different emotional temperatures, all trying to get food into that small body. When one approach failed, another might succeed. Your ancestors brute forced the problem of picky eating not through tricks or techniques, but through sheer numbers of people who cared. The second adaptation was chemical. For thousands of years, human breast milk served as the ultimate fallback. Neanderthal children, our closest evolutionary cousins, nursed for roughly 2.5 years, according to a 2018 study by biological anthropologist Tanya Smith of Griffith University in Australia, who traced barium levels in the tooth enamel of 2 Neanderthal children from the Payer archaeological site in southeast France. Those kids lived 250,000 years ago, and their teeth told a story. Steady nursing through cold winters, through periods of illness marked by stress lines in their enamel, through seasons when solid food must have been scarce or refused. The breast was the emergency supply that never ran out. When a child wouldn't eat anything else, breast milk kept them alive. It was always available, always accepted, always nutritionally complete. And this is where something fascinating emerges. Neanderthal children at the Fiumane Cave and Broyon Cave sites in northeastern Italy, studied by Alessia Nava of the University of Kent and Federico Lugli of the University of Bologna, began weaning onto solid food at around 5 to 6 months of age, almost exactly when modern human infants do. The energy demands of a growing human brain appear to trigger this transition across species and across millennia. The brain is hungry. The brain doesn't care whether the child wants to eat or not, and when the child resisted, the mother's body simply kept producing the one food the child's instincts told them was safe. The third adaptation came later, and it changed everything. Around 7,000 years ago, as humans in Europe shifted from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, a new option appeared: animal milk. In 2019, Dr. Julie Dunn of the University of Bristol analyzed residues found inside small spouted clay vessels, essentially ancient baby bottles, recovered from Bronze and Iron Age infant graves in Bavaria, dating between 1200 and 450 BC. The molecular fingerprints inside those tiny pots revealed fats from ruminant milk, likely goat or cow. For the first time, human infants could be fed something other than breast milk that didn't require premastication. A child who refused chewed meat could be offered warm animal milk from a clay vessel. It wasn't perfect. Those vessels were almost impossible to clean properly, and infection was a real risk. But it was a new option in the ancient toolkit of keeping reluctant eaters alive. And it may have been revolutionary. Dr. Dunn argues that the ability to wean children onto animal milk freed mothers to have more children more quickly, contributing to the massive population expansion of early agricultural societies. But here's the hardest truth buried in all of this research, and it's the one nobody wants to say out loud. Sometimes, none of it worked. A child who truly wouldn't eat, whether from illness, from sensory aversion that we might now recognize as something like ARFID, from the neurological differences that have always existed in our species, that child, in the ancient world, very often died. Not from malice, not from neglect, from the brutal mathematics of a world without feeding tubes, without intravenous nutrition, without chewable iron supplements shaped like cartoon characters. Volk and Atkinson's data is unambiguous. 27% of hunter-gatherer infants died in their first year alone. The skeletal evidence from the Indian Knoll archaeological site in Kentucky, dating to around 2500 BC, suggests that 56% of children in that Paleolithic community didn't survive to puberty. Some of those small skeletons show signs of nutritional stress, stunted growth, weakened bones, teeth scarred with lines that record periods when the body simply didn't have enough. We will never know how many of those children were the ones who refused to eat, the ones whose neophobia crossed from adaptive instinct into fatal stubbornness, the ones whose brains were trying to protect them from poison and accidentally starved them instead. Your ancestors grieved those children. The Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan holds Neanderthal remains dating back 60,000 years, including individuals with severe disabilities who were clearly kept alive and cared for by their communities for years. These were people who loved fiercely, who fought to keep their vulnerable members alive, and who sometimes lost that fight. The ancient world was not indifferent to a child who wouldn't eat. It was desperate. It tried everything it had. Premastication, extended breastfeeding, animal milk in tiny clay pots, networks of grandmothers and aunts and older children, each taking their turn trying to coax food into a small, clenched mouth. An entire species organized around the overwhelming biological imperative to get calories into the next generation. The ancient world threw everything it had at the problem of a child who refused to eat, and what it built in response: cooperative breeding, communal kitchens, shared feeding, the deep mammalian technology of mouth-to-mouth nourishment, became the architecture of human society itself. And then, on the other side of all that effort, all that grief, all those millennia of trying, there stood the children who made it, the ones who eventually opened their mouths, the ones who accepted the chewed paste from a grandmother's lips or the warm milk from a clay cup, the ones whose neophobia faded just enough, just in time. They grew up, they became parents, they did the whole thing over again. You're standing in your kitchen, it's 6:47 p.m. There's sweet potato on the floor, and your child is asking for crackers. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a flicker of ancient panic, a whisper from deep inside the species that says, this child needs to eat, they need to eat now, what if they don't eat? That panic is 250,000 years old. It's the same feeling that drove a Neanderthal mother in a cave in southeastern France to nurse through a freezing winter. The same urgency that made a woman on the Bavarian plains pour goat's milk into a tiny clay bottle and press it to her baby's lips. You hand over the crackers, your child eats. And without knowing it, you just completed the oldest negotiation in human history. The one between a species that cannot afford to lose its young and a child whose own biology is screaming at them to be afraid of food. Every ancestor you have won that negotiation at least once. That's why you're here.